Good day. I am tasked to discuss epidemiologic investigation of a disease outbreak. At the end of the session, the students shall be able to explain the public health relevance of conducting an epidemiologic investigation of a disease outbreak and discuss the basic steps in an epidemiologic investigation of a disease outbreak, including the giving of public health recommendations on curbing or controlling the epidemic. In our lifetime, we have witnessed several epidemics already, but perhaps the most popular of which will be the most recent COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at all these epidemics, from a public health perspective, we have initiated several um, strategies to control these epidemics. Now, why is it important that we investigate a disease outbreak? Some of the reasons why it is imperative that we investigate disease outbreaks would include for the control and prevention of similar outbreaks, for research opportunities, for training opportunities, for considerations of various health programs, and for political, public, and legal concerns. Let's go over them one by one. In terms of control and prevention, we want to control the outbreak, and how do we do this? We describe the characteristics of the population at risk, and we prevent development of new additional cases. On the other hand, preventing future outbreaks would entail investigating the sources of the outbreak, and we need to initiate, in design, and institute control measures. The balance between instituting control measures and conducting further investigations will depend on how much the epidemiologic investigator will know about the agent causing the illness, the source of the agent, and its mode of transmission, since one cannot design control measures without the extent of such information. We talk about research opportunities. For a newly recognized disease, this is a way for us to characterize who are the people at risk for developing such a medical condition? What are the associated risk factors? And we are able to delineate and describe the clinical spectrum of the illness. If this is something that is already familiar to us, perhaps a re-emerging infectious disease, the use of new diagnostic technology or laboratory techniques would also be an opportunity to do further research. Or if we want to identify new therapeutic agents or any other medical interventions for purposes of um, instigating control measures, then these are all opportunities to do research. A disease outbreak or epidemic will provide an opportunity to revisit this and study the natural history of the disease entity, and we go back to the interaction of the agent, host, and environment. In terms of training opportunities, investigating an outbreak will require a combination of diplomacy, logical thinking, problem solving skills, quantitative skills, epidemiological know how, and good clinical judgment. These epidemiologic public health skills will improve the practice and experience of the people, of the stakeholders in a given scenario. For this reason, many investigative teams will often pair a seasoned epidemiologist with an epidemiologist in training who gains valuable on the job training and experience while assisting in the investigation and the control of the outbreak. In terms of health program considerations, outbreaks will often put health officials in the Philippine setting, the Department of Health, at a position to review existing public health programs in terms of discovering populations at risk that may have been overlooked, recognizing failures in the program's intervention strategy, distinguishing changes in the agent causing the disease, identifying events beyond the scope of the program, among other concerns. There will also be public, political, or legal concerns that sometimes override scientific concerns in the decision to conduct an investigation. Increasingly, the public has taken an interest in disease clusters and potential environmental exposures and has called upon health departments to investigate. Nevertheless, many health departments have learned that it is essential to be responsibly responsive to public concerns, even if the concern has little scientific basis. They also see these instances as opportunities to educate the general public. How do we conduct an epidemiologic investigation? Speed is essential, but getting the right answer is likewise critical. To satisfy both requirements, epidemiologists approach investigations systematically, often following 10 basic steps. These steps, however, they are presented in conceptual order, but several may be done at the same time, or they may be done in a different order. There is no hard and fast rule as to how we conduct the epidemiologic investigation. But what is imperative is that control measures should be implemented as soon as the source and mode of transmission are known, which may be early or late in any particular outbreak investigation. According to the US Centers for Disease Prevention and Control, these are the 10 steps that ought to be fulfilled when we do an epidemiologic investigation of a disease outbreak. Let me be quick in reiterating that these steps are mere guides and that it is not a stringent chronological flow of events. Some of these steps can occur simultaneously, but for academic purposes, I will just break down these steps sequentially, beginning with preparing for fieldwork. Before leaving for the field, the epidemiologic investigator should research the disease and gather the needed supplies and equipment in the conduct of the investigation. It is also prudent that we make necessary administrative and personal arrangements for such things as travel. For example, if you are going to an area where it might be considered a geographically isolated and disadvantaged area, it might be interesting to get the involvement of the stakeholders of the community, the key leaders, the people at the grassroots level, who will assist you in the conduct of your fieldwork. There may also be a need to consult with all other parties to determine one's role in the investigation and the local contacts who will be assisting in the investigation once a public health officer is on the scene, arrives on the scene. Whenever we do epidemiologic investigation of a disease outbreak, we always want to achieve a certain form of networking because not all epidemic related diseases would have a purely medical approach to its control and prevention. Let's talk about preparing for fieldwork. If you revisit what happened to us at the peak of this or at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were always preparing ourselves, especially the medical frontliners, to protect ourselves. It was important that we were educated on what proper personal protective equipment or personal protective devices would be necessary when we cater to the needs of the people who are sick. At the During the COVID-19 pandemic, allow me to share this infographic that we use at the UP Philippine General Hospital, which served as one of the centers for COVID-19 referral at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you visited PGH at the early 2000 or first 9 months of 2020 rather, We were implementing strict um use of PPEs, or personal protective equipment, depending on which area of the hospital you would be assigned. So there would be level 1 protection PPE, level 2, level 2.5, 3, 4, so on and so forth. Just to illustrate, if you were, let's say, in the intensive care unit, these were just some of what we were donning when we were attending to patients with COVID, especially during the peak at the start of the early 2020s. Just wanted to share with you a funny anecdote with regard to the PPE. As a fresh graduate, I remember one of my first stints as a doctor, as a licensed doctor, was that I worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs in 2003. So I was assigned to the DFA, and one of my tasks was, if ever there would be on-call need for doctors, I would be one of the first responders. Recall that in 2003, it was when the SARS epidemic rather, um, was first recognized, in particular in Hong Kong and in Southeast Asia. I remember, so I was in the clinic of the Department of Foreign Affairs in Pasay, and then I received a phone call from one of the immigration officers telling me that there was a person who was suspected to have SARS. And at that time, we still didn't have SARS in the Philippines. And so that innocent that innocent, naive, and egoistic mentality of mine was telling me that, oh, this could be your claim to fame. That I could be the doctor who first documented a Filipina who worked in Hong Kong. She was returning to the Philippines with possible SARS. So SARS was the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And I vividly remember how zealous and eager I was to see the patient at the holding area, at the immigration area in Pasay, the DFA. And so I went down from my clinic, I went down, I examined the patient, and then I followed protocol. I immediately informed the Department of Health that there was a suspect who could be the first potential SARS patient in the Philippines. So in my mind, I was thinking this could be your claim to fame. The first doctor to ever document SARS in the Philippines. And so after examining the patient, I was seated beside the patient. And I remember waiting for the DOH people to come to the DFA, the Department of Foreign Affairs, to pick up the patient after about 30-40 minutes of waiting. So I was chit-chatting. I was sitting next to the lady, and we were casually chit-chatting. And then all of a sudden I heard the sirens of the ambulance coming in. And then all of a sudden, all the people from the quarantine section came down from the ambulance. They were all wearing level 4 PPEs. And there I was. I was just wearing my white blazer with no mask on, with no goggles, nothing. It was just my plain self with my stethoscope on my neck. And then the quarantine people suddenly talked to the patient. Then they literally just got the patient, put her inside the ambulance, and they left. And they didn't even talk to me. And all the while I was shocked because they were in level 4 PPE. Then there I was left all alone. And in my head, I was saying, oh, shoot, what will happen to me? They didn't even bother that I was seated next to her. And then they just left. And then I had to charge it to experience it. And I kept on praying, oh God, oh God, oh God, please, 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 please. I hope she is not the first SARS patient of the Philippines. And I kept on praying for the next 2, 3 days until finally I was cleared that the woman did not have SARS. But lesson learned, you shouldn't just, for thinking of fame, you should always be prepared for field work. If there is a need or there is a requirement for donning your PPEs, please do so. Do not make that foolish mistake of having that egoistic mentality, thinking of having your claim to fame, not realizing or not being competent enough to realize that you ought to wear PPEs when you do field work. Moving on. Is this really an outbreak or not? So we need to establish the existence of an outbreak. One of the first important tasks as a field investigator is to verify that the suspected epidemic is indeed a real outbreak. An epidemic need not be a great number of individuals. For example, if you are catering to something that is highly infectious, let's say meningococcemia, or rabies for that matter. Just a single case of I'll stick with meningococcemia. Or back then, no, in 2010, when we declared we were the Philippines as poliomyelitis free. Just a single case of poliomyelitis could be considered an epidemic already, depending on the public health burden or potential of that medical condition. So when we say epidemic, it doesn't have to be multiple numbers. We could have just a single case of a highly communicable disease, and we can categorically say it is still an epidemic. So some will turn out to be true outbreaks with a common cause, some will be unrelated cases of the same disease, and others will turn out to be unrelated cases of similar but unrelated diseases. Before deciding whether an outbreak truly exists, one must first determine the expected number of cases for the area in the given time frame. Always take note that an outbreak is defined as an observed number of cases that will exceed what is the expected number for that particular geographical area. So if you will recall from previous lectures, this is how we would graphically illustrate endemic versus epidemic versus something that is pandemic. There are other illustrations that also illustrate the other figures that would show what is sporadic distribution of diseases. So it is essential that you are able to fully recognize whether or not this is indeed an outbreak or not. Usually one can compare the current number of cases with the number from the previous weeks or months or from a comparable period during previous years. Other sources of data would be, let's say, for example, if you are referring to notifiable diseases, you can look into the surveillance records of the health departments, in particular, the Philippine Integrated Disease Surveillance and Response, or the PIDS-R. And remember, in our previous lectures, we have mentioned there are conditions which are regarded that are epidemic prone. There are those that are being targeted for elimination, and those that would really warrant a high suspicion, a high index of suspicion for public health concerns. So I want you to go back and revisit what are these conditions that are regarded as epidemic prone, because it is imperative, or it is technically important that as doctors or as healthcare providers, healthcare professionals in the field of infectious medicine, communicable diseases, or tropical medicine, you should be able to properly identify whether or not it is really an outbreak or not. So make sure that you are aware of what we refer to as epidemic prone medical conditions. For other diseases and conditions, one can also find data from local sources. For example, hospital discharge records, mortality records, cancer or birth defect registries. If local data are not available, one can make estimates using data from neighboring states or other international sources of information, or one might even consider conducting a telephone survey among doctors to determine whether they have seen more cases of the disease than usual. Even if the current number of reported cases would exceed the expected number, the excess may not necessarily indicate an outbreak. What do you mean by this? Sometimes reporting may rise because of changes in the local reporting procedures, revisions in the case definitions, increased interest of because of local or national awareness, or sometimes even improvements with the diagnostic procedures. For example, if we would say that when we diagnose tuberculosis, we rely solely on sputum on direct smear microscopy, but with the advent of newer modalities, let's say your expert, your gene expert, or your polymerase chain reaction, there is now a faster way to diagnose tuberculosis. And there could be an initial paradoxical increase in the number of cases if there is an improvement with the diagnostic procedures. Other factors may come into play, including, for example, the severity of the illness, the potential for spread, seasonal population changes, political considerations, public relations, and the availability of resources. We want to always verify the diagnosis. In addition to ensuring the existence of an outbreak early in the investigation, one must identify as accurately as possible the specific nature of the disease. What are the goals in verifying? The goals in verifying the diagnosis are often twofold. We want to ensure that the problem has been properly diagnosed, meaning to say that it really is what has been reported to be. And for outbreaks involving infectious or toxic chemical agents, one must be certain that the increase in diagnosed cases is not a result of a mistake in the laboratory. Going back to our scenario for COVID-19, if you look at the way we diagnose COVID-19, it's significantly improved from the early 2020s to 2021 to 2022 until 2023, when we were almost already out of the forest in terms of COVID-19. The evolution of the diagnosis using the antibodies, an indirect way to measure if there would be adequate defense against potential antigen, to the actual identification of the antigen, to the advent to the advent of the use of your polymerase chain reaction or your RT-PCR. So again, the way we diagnose things, the faster. Remember when we first when we were doing when at the early 2020s when we were talking of COVID-19, it would normally take 2 weeks for the RT-PCR to come out. And so during that time period, the 2 weeks of waiting, most of the patients were placed in isolate and in quarantine while waiting for the RT-PCR to come out. But now, because of more molecular diagnostic laboratory tests that are capable of doing RT-PCR, it is so easy now to diagnose COVID-19. So the evolution of how we establish the correct diagnosis is also reflected with the historical development of such diagnostic testing. Define and identify the cases. We need to establish proper operational definitions of the cases, a standard set of criteria for deciding whether, for purpose of the investigation, a person should be classified as having the disease or health condition under study. A case definition would often include four components: clinical data, characteristics about the people who are affected, information about the location or place where the infection most probably happened, and a specification of time during which the outbreak occurred. One should base the clinical criteria on simple and objective measures. In terms of time characteristics, the criterion might be onset of illness with a specified temporal interval. For place characteristics, specify a particular geographical area, and whatever the diagnostic criteria set, one must apply them consistently and without bias to all of the people included in the investigation. Ideally, the case definition should be broad enough to include most, if not all, of the actual cases without capturing what are called the false positive cases. Recognizing the uncertainty of some diagnoses, and the investigators often use terminologies such as confirmed, probable, or possible. When I say confirmed, this is often a laboratory confirmation, laboratory verification of the diagnosis. Probable cases would have the typical clinical features without the laboratory confirmation, while suspects or possible cases would often have the fewer typical clinical features. This is the older definition of COVID 19. So this was released in December 2020, but across the globe, the World Health Organization defined what are suspected cases, probable cases, and confirmed cases. Please be warned that the operational definition eventually changed with the introduction of the RT-PCR. We also talk about case surveillance. As noted above, many outbreaks are first recognized and reported by concerned healthcare providers or citizens. In some outbreaks, public health officials may decide to alert the public directly, usually through local media. I am unsure if you still recall, but in January 30, 2020, it was the first time that Secretary Francisco Duque of the Department of Health confirmed that we did have the novel coronavirus of 2019 in the Philippines. If an outbreak affects a population who a population in a restricted setting, one may want to conduct a survey of the entire population. In such settings, one can administer a questionnaire to determine the true occurrence of clinical symptoms, or one can collect laboratory specimens to determine the number of asymptomatic cases. Finally, you can ask people who are affected if they know anyone else with the same condition, and this is what we mean by contact tracing. Now, traditionally, epidemiologists collect the pertinent information on what we refer to as their standard case report form, a questionnaire, or a data abstraction form. Just so you are aware, this is the actual case report form that we used during the COVID-19 pandemic. I remember the first time I accomplished this, I was at the medical city where I hold my private practice, and I remember receiving a 40 plus year old businesswoman who came in from Guangzhou, China, complaining of respiratory symptoms. Remember, I shared my story of the SARS, the SARS, my SARS um, horror story. And so this time, when I was looking at this woman, again, another woman from China, I was more cautious. The good thing was I was now prepared because um, I actually came in January 2020, right before we started having that. So Duque announced that we had COVID in January 30, 2020. First few weeks, middle part of January 2020, I was in Singapore and I was chit-chatting with my friends from the Singaporean Ministry of Health, my former colleagues at the UPP, the Philippine General Hospital. I was talking with some of my vaccinology friends. So I already knew that the COVID-19 was about to, we called it nCoV back then, the novel coronavirus of 2019. I knew that we were already starting to experience COVID in different parts of Southeast Asia. And that is why when I came back to the Philippines, I was warned. My Singaporean-based friends were telling me, RG, dapat naka-PPE na kayo sa clinics. Hindi kayo pwedeng, ano lang, na papetics-petics na hindi kayo prepared. So at the start of, when I came back, every time I would hold clinic, I would already wear my my mask. But of course, it wasn't N95 yet. It was just a regular mask. And so when I first saw this woman, I remember I was a bit anxious when I was accomplishing this form, and then I was calling the PIDS-R, not the Philippine Integrated Disease Surveillance and Response Team. They coursed me to the RITM, the Research Institute for Tropical Medicine, and we were tasked to look into several data, the identifying data of the patient. They asked me about the name, the address, contact details of the patient, and allow the public health investigators to contact people for additional questioning if necessary, or to notify them of any potential laboratory results and outcome of the investigation. In the same manner, in terms of mapping the geographic extent of the problem, the information here would be very vital. In terms of the demography of the patient, this would include sex, age, race, occupation, details that the epidemiologist might need to characterize the population at risk. We also got information on the clinical data, looking into onset of symptoms, anything that would help the epidemiologist really characterize the disease. So there could be supplementary clinical information, whether the person was hospitalized or the patient died. So these are all important data that the epidemiologist may warrant, risk factor information. And of course, you also needed to get data from the doctor himself, the person who was reporting the case. And during the first few weeks of November, it was so easy to call RITM. No? When you call them after three, four rings, they would already pick up. They would attend to you quickly. But as the days passed, no, from January to February, it was getting more difficult to get through our ITM. So we were seeing more and more suspects, and we were just diligently filling up all the forms until that fateful March 15th, if I remember correctly, March 15, 2020, when then President Rodrigo Roa Duterte placed the entire Philippines and enhanced community quarantine. And the rest is history. And of course, during that time, I really felt anxious. No, whenever I would report to the RITM, I would wait for data whether or not they would inform us, oh, this is a confirmed case. And it was really nerve-wracking back then. But it's part of the job as a medical frontliner. At the medical city, we catered to a lot of patients. Some of the patients were coming from other parts of the globe, some of them even from China. And so it was really such a there was the anxiety level was very high, especially during the first 6 months of 2020, no? When we were first dealing with COVID-19. We also describe and orient the data in terms of descriptive epidemiology: time, place, person, variables. Once data have been collected, epidemiologic investigators can begin to characterize an outbreak by time, place, and person variables. This provides a comprehensive description of an outbreak by showing its trend over time, its geographic extent, the populations affected by the disease. This description lets the epidemiologic investigators assess the outbreak in light of what is known about the disease, in particular the usual source, modes of transmission, the risk factors, the populations most probably affected, and this is when we develop possible cause effect relationships or causal hypotheses. So, in terms of characterizing the epidemic by time, it is imperative that you know how to do a simple epidemic curve. Traditionally, public health investigators and epidemiologists show the time course of an epidemic by drawing a graph of the number of cases by their date of onset. This graph, which we call the epi curve, gives a visual display of the outbreak's magnitude and temporal trend. Now, an epidemic curve will provide a great deal of information. First, it will tell where the population is in the terms of the epidemic and possibly to project its future behavior. It can also establish the probable incubation period, and it will give us a logical estimate as to what the time period of exposure is. Finally, it may draw inferences about the epidemic curve, whether it is an outbreak resulting from a common source, exposure, from person to person spread, or both. Epidemic curves can also be used to estimate two important outbreak characteristics. First, the probable incubation period, and second, the period of exposure of the causative organism. If the timing of the presumed exposure is known, epidemic curves can be used to estimate the incubation period of the disease, and this may facilitate the identification of the causative agent. This is because the period between the known or hypothesized exposure time and the peak of the epidemic curve will represent the hypothesized median incubation period. If the etiologic pathogen is known and therefore both the incubation period and the median incubation period are also identified already, then the date of exposure can be computed as the date of the peak minus the mean incubation period. For example, if you have cases with the peak of the cases occurring, let's say, on March 13, 2025, and you do know that the mean incubation period for a particular pathogen is approximately 9 days, then the date of possible exposure will be March 4. And how did we derive this? It is simply March 13 minus 9 days. This will give us March 4. If you are to do an epidemic curve, so again, let's see, for example, on the horizontal axis, you have the number of days, and then you plot the number of cases that were documented on each day. And let's say you noted that on March 19, this is where the peak of occurred date of peak of incidents. And then you know the incubation periods to be somewhere about 9 days. And so you will be able to determine the date of exposure. If the range of the incubation period is already known because the epidemiologic pathogen has been identified accordingly, then the exposure period can likewise be computed as follows: the date of start of the symptoms or of the cases minus the minimum incubation period, and then you also determine the date of the last documented case minus the maximum incubation period. For example, if you know that the incubation period is somewhere from 5 to 14 days, if you know that the first case was documented on March 7, and the last cases were documented on March 18. How do we do this? So, incubation period again is 5 to 14 days. The first day, the start of the cases was documented on March 7. So March 7 minus 5 it will be March 2. Well, the date of end of the cases, let's say, was documented on March 18. March 18 minus 14 days, this will give us March 4. And so we will know that somewhere from March 2 to March 4 will be the exposure period. So again, looking at the epidemic curve or the epi curve, these are data that we can accomplish or that we can derive, and it will give us a good idea as to when to really investigate a particular epidemic. I'm not sure if you still remember, but at the peak of the COVID-19 epidemic, from March 2020 until perhaps 2022 or 2023, the Department of Health will come up with a daily in the dashboard for COVID-19. They will come up with a daily epidemic curve. And these are some of the illustrations of the different epidemic curves that you can perhaps generate that will allow us to identify whether or not there is only a point source of contamination, a common continuous source, common intermittent sources, or propagated sources of your epidemics. Again, looking at all of these different types of epidemic curves, you will get a more or less a good idea as to the behavior of the medical condition. We'll also characterize the epidemic by place. Assessment of an epidemic by place will provide information on the geographic extent of a problem and may also show clusters or patterns that provide clues to the identity and origins of the problem. A simple and useful technique for looking at geographic patterns is to plot where the affected people live, work, or may have been exposed. And this is what we refer to as your spot map of the area. This is for dengue, just to illustrate that as early as 2019, the World Health Organization has been monitoring dengue also in the Philippines. And if you and then because it has become also a public health problem in the country. And if you look at the spot map, this is how by just looking at the hot spots in the spot map, you would identify what places in the Philippine archipelago would have the highest cases of your dengue. So this is just an illustration of how your spot map can be very helpful in characterizing the epidemic according to place. Lastly, characterizing by person. Determine what populations are at risk for the disease by characterizing an outbreak by person. We'll look into personal characteristics, exposure variables, And these factors are important because they may be related to the susceptibility to the disease and to the opportunities for possible exposure. Age and sex are usually assessed first because they're often the characteristics most strongly related to exposure and to the risk of disease. Other characteristics will be more specific to disease under investigation and the setting of the outbreak. We then develop our hypothesis of causation. In real life, epidemiologic investigators usually begin to generate hypotheses to explain why and how the outbreak occurred the very first instance that we learn about them. The hypothesis should address the source of the agent, the mode of transmission, and the exposures that cause the disease. In addition, your hypothesis should be proposed in a way that can be tested. We evaluate the hypothesis. You want to make sure that the credibility of the hypothesis is something that we can test. And there are two approaches that one can use depending on the nature of the data. Comparison of the hypothesis with the established facts could be used, or we can do analytic epidemiology, which would allow the epidemiologic investigators to test for hypotheses. And this is why you must know different analytical epidemiologic designs. For example, if you recall, our cohort studies are very useful for determining risk ratios, while our case control studies would be able to generate your odds ratio. Remember, these are observational analytical study designs. We are not doing a clinical trial. We only observe things as they happen in real life. Ergo, it is imperative that you know what research designs to employ if you want to test hypothesis of causation linking one independent variable with a possible dependent variable. Let's talk about the origins of your novel coronavirus or your COVID-19. If we go with what we knew from previous coronavirus epidemics, remember we had multiple epidemics involving your coronavirus. We had the SARS in 2002. We had the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome in 2012. And then in 2019, the pandemic happened. And where did this coronavirus come from? If you are to look at existing levels of knowledge, where does the coronavirus normally thrive? In terms of its predilection for the mammalian species, we do know that coronaviruses coming from the bats have been implicated to share its origins to the civet, which was the source of the SARS epidemic, then to the camels for the MERS-CoV epidemic. Then now, in 2020, we were still unsure. Where did the SARS-19 come from? There were data to suggest that it could have come from reptilian snakes, reptilian species, but some say it could have come from the pangolin or your pangolin, which is one of the rare mammals that we see in China. So we really don't know. But what we are trying to hypothesize here is that looking into the previous coronavirus epidemics, it appears that the coronavirus originating from the bats that eventually was passed on to other animals could be a possible source of the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic. So, is this really a zoonotic infection or not? We don't know. But newer data, fast forward to 2023, there were studies that would link or try to suggest that the raccoon dogs, which were also common in China, were now being implicated as the potential source of the COVID-19 virus, or the source, the point source, or the source rather, of the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, this is not yet fully acceptable. It's not yet 100% established. But this is perhaps one of the stronger epidemiological data that has genetic evidence to link the COVID-19 to another mammalian species that could have started all the COVID-19 pandemic. What about foodborne epidemics? How do we come up with hypotheses as to what could be the culprit in producing a certain outbreak, foodborne outbreak? Foodborne outbreak, as the name implies, is a vehicle-borne type of outbreak. What we can do, let's say, for example, there is a party, and then after the party, people starting getting intoxicated because of possible food poisoning. This could be an outbreak. How do we investigate it? For whatever party that you can have, you can enumerate or enlist all the food items that were consumed. Then divide the population as to those who consumed that food product and those who did not consume the product. Among those who consumed the product, who became ill, who remained well. In the same manner, among those who did not consume the food product, how many did not get sick, how many remained well, and how many got sick rather. Let's focus our attention first to baked ham. If this is the set of data that you have, how will we know what could be the potential food culprit or food item that instigated, that started that precipitated the outbreak? We determine the attack rate. And how do we determine the attack rate? So looking at your baked ham, let's, for example, focus our attention on this row. You can determine the attack rate by determining, for those who ate the baked ham, this is how you determine the attack rate. And for those who did not eat the baked ham, this is how you determine the attack rate. If you get the ratio of these two, this is now your risk ratio. So let's go back to our table. If we are now able to generate the attack rate for all those who consume the various food products, and you also determine the attack rate for all those who did not assume the said food product, and you determine the risk ratio, you will notice that here, the one with the highest risk ratio is most probably the culprit that started the foodborne outbreak. We also want to we want to make sure that when you generate your risk ratio, that this is really true, that it is not merely due to chance. One way of determining this is to establish its statistical significance. So the final step in testing the hypothesis is to determine how likely it is that epidemiologic investigation results could have occurred by chance alone. A test of statistical significance is used to evaluate this likelihood. The first step in testing for statistical significance is to assume that the exposure is not related to the disease, and this is what we refer to as our null hypothesis. Compute for the measure of association, in this case your risk ratio or your odds ratio, and determine whether you can do a chi-square analysis to determine if it is statistically or significant. Once the value for the chi-square has been calculated, determine the corresponding p-value in a table of chi-squares. Remember, if these are your study designs, always go back. How do we establish the link or the association of cause-effect relationship between an exposure variable and an outcome variable? So I want you to always go back to the general schema of these two observational analytical designs that can be utilized to investigate any disease outbreak. And from here, we determine The measure of association, again, for case controls, we can determine the odds ratio. If it is a cohort study, we generate the risk ratio or the relative risk. And we also look into the p-value. In interpreting p-values, the epidemiologic investigator will set a cutoff point beyond which he will consider the chance is a factor. And often we put this threshold or a cutoff common cutoff at 0.05. When a p-value is below this predetermined cutoff, let's say the p-value is less than 0.05, then the finding is considered statistically significant, allowing us to reject the null hypothesis. And this will allow us to conclude that the exposure variable is indeed associated with the disease. And the smaller the p-value, the stronger the evidence that your data will be statistically significant. Then we refine hypotheses and carry out additional studies. I remember one foolish comment from one of our lackluster senators who said that, bakit ba kayo baliw na baliw sa research? Aanihin nyo ba yung research na yan? If we are men and women of science, we are staunch advocates of evidence-based medicine. If we followed this foolish lady, then we wouldn't have reached what we do know now of the COVID-19 pandemic. When analytical epidemiological studies do not confirm hypotheses of the public health investigators, one may need to reconsider his or her hypothesis and look for new vehicles or modes of transmission by doing more epidemiologic research. Sino ngayon ang baliw, no? Yung hindi marunong gumawa ng research o yung mga gumagawa ng research. This is the time to meet with case patients to look for common links and possibly refine the probable hypothesis of causation. As advocates of evidence-based medicine, there will always be yearning for learning. There will be an insatiable desire for us to seek wisdom. That is why we do research. Even when analytical studies already identified an association between an exposure and a disease, epidemiologic investigators will often need to refine hypothesis of causation. When an outbreak occurs, whether it is routine or unusual, ought to consider what questions remain unanswered about the disease and what kind of epidemiological research one might use in the particular setting to answer some of these questions. The circumstances may allow one to learn more about the disease, its modes of transmission, the characteristics of the agent, and host factors. While epidemiology can implicate vehicles and guide appropriate public health action, laboratory evidence can clinch the findings. Environmental studies often help explain why an outbreak occurred and may be very important in some settings. Let's talk about the vaccine. Because of the vaccine research, we were able to fast track the process of developing the needed COVID-19 vaccines under public health emergencies without compromising safety. So imagine if we did not do further research, just like what the senator hinted na bakit tayo baliw na baliw sa research. Wala tayong kinahinatnan. That is why, even if you look at the way the vaccines were released, that's why we still have the post-marketing surveillance. Even if it already achieved FDA approval for emergency use authorizations, research will not stop. We still continue to do research because we do post-marketing surveillance. We want to make sure that vaccines would not have long-term complications. We want to ensure that we will always prioritize the safety of the general public. Ergo, it is imperative that we always do more epidemiologic research. Kaya tayo baliw na baliw sa research. Then we implement prevention and control measures. Implementing public health measures may actually be done at any stage of an epidemic, especially if the source of the disease outbreak is already known or established. Control measures are often aimed at addressing one of the many specific links in the chain of infection or towards the agent, the source, or the reservoir. In some outbreaks, preventive and control measures are directed to reducing susceptibility. Remember this, the breaking the chain of infection. This is why for even for foodborne outbreaks, let's say cholera or what have you, we always look into all the factors. And when we come up with preventive measures, control measures, we look at each link and we try to implement strategies that would break each link of the chain of infection. Because at every link, there are preventive measures that can be performed to minimize transmission and control spread of the infection. In the case of COVID-19, we always did contact. We wanted to do contact tracing for some time, but of course, no, sadly, the Department of Health failed in doing efficient contact tracing. There were efforts to do contact tracing, but of course, we were not really that successful. We implemented quarantine and isolation protocols, which is also another layer of protective measure in terms of controlling and preventing further transmission. And most importantly, because of research, we did a lot of the vaccine. We received the primary doses, then the booster doses. For the medical frontliners, I received a total of 5 doses. My first two were my first two vaccines were the AstraZeneca. Then I received heterologous boosters. My first booster dose was Pfizer. My second booster dose was Moderna. Then my fifth and last booster was the bivalent Pfizer vaccine. Even though we have already uh, passed, we were already out of the woods. We're out of danger already, technically. But we are still vigilant that there could be a resurgence of uh, of this dreaded of coronavirus infection. And so we must always be on the lookout. That's why we don't we do not become complacent. And there will be new technology, if there will be a need to give yearly annual vaccination, we comply with the guidelines. Because as I've said, the guidelines are based on robust epidemiological data that would tell us on what measures must be done to control further spread of this disease. I mentioned already about active surveillance. Once controlled preventive measures have been implemented, efficacy effectiveness of interventions ought to be monitored. If surveillance has not been ongoing, now is the perfect time to initiate active surveillance. If active surveillance was initiated as part of case finding efforts, then therefore it should be continued, especially if the epidemic has not been completely resolved. The reasons for conducting active surveillance are twofold. First, one must continue to monitor the situation and to determine whether the prevention and control measures are indeed working. And second, one ought to know whether the outbreak has spread outside its original area or to the area where the interventions were targeted. If so, effective disease control and prevention measures must be implemented in these new areas. Sorry, my throat is really parched. I'm still recovering from a very bad upper respiratory tract infection. My voice is not yet 100% fully recovered. So I apologize if I keep on drinking in the middle of my lecture. So just to reiterate, in terms of the monitoring surveillance, I wanted to introduce the concept of the R naught. This is one of the more commonly heard of in the news during the COVID-19 pandemic. The R refers to the effective reproduction number, and it measures the capacity of an infectious agent to spread. The R number signifies the average number of individuals that one sick patient will successfully pass the infectious agent to. The R naught refers to the infectious agent's transmission rate within any given population with no established immunity against the pathogen. Let's say, for example, the anti vaxxers. Now, the R number is not fixed. However, it is influenced by a myriad of factors, including not just how infectious a disease is, but how it develops over time. Meaning to say, we look into its virulence and infectivity, or we also look into population dynamics and immunity status that have been conferred already from previous infections or because of successful vaccination. Location is also pivotal for densely populated areas are expected to have higher R compared to a sparsely peopled rural area. Now, this is how we normally illustrate the R naught and the R. An R of 1 and above would suggest that there is still an exponential growth of cases. An R of below 1 uh, tends towards the end of the outbreak. Now, look at this. When we started to stop monitoring COVID-19, if you look at the data, the most recent data, as of 2022, this was in June 2022, the data here says that uh, the current reproduction number in the National Capital Region has increased to 1.24 as of May 31 to June 6, compared to its previous R naught of 1.028. So in 2022, when we were saying, oh, we were almost out of the woods, we are already able to control the COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at the data, not so true because the R was still 1.24. And look at this. As of April 2023, what is the cumulative positivity rate of COVID in the Philippines based on the one of the later, kasi tinigil na yung paggawa netong, ito yung sinasabi kong, uh, what do you call this, the dashboard of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there came a time when the DOH was no longer updating the dashboard. So this was the one of the last few generated information from COVID. Look at the epi curve of COVID-19 in the Philippines. Look at the data from the DOH. Our cumulative positivity rate as of April 2023, and we stopped monitoring COVID 2023. But what do the experts tell us according to the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health? Look at this. As a rule of thumb, one threshold for the person positive being too high is 5%. 5% is already too high. Our positivity rate was 13 point something based on the DOH. And according to the Okta Research Group, it was 6.5. It is still above the threshold of 5 and below. So this is the reason why it is important that you understand certain data. Diba, nung patapos na to, so we had a new administrator, iba ng gobyerno natin ng 2023, di ba? As of 2023, nung lahat tayo sinasabi, oh, tapos na yung pandemya, okay na tayo. Tapos na ba talaga ng mga panahon na ito? Nung sinabi ng gobyerno, let's open the economy, let's reopen the everything. Well, technically, from a public health perspective, hindi pa. But we do understand from an economic perspective, kailangan na kasi magbukas yung ekonomiya. So you see the balance between health economics and public health. There is a difference sometimes, no? But again, the thing is, we must be critical or we must be knowledgeable in understanding these data for us to really understand the entire concept of the epidemic. The last will be to communicate findings of an epidemiologic investigation. We must cascade the findings of our study to all relevant stakeholders. Communication may involve oral briefing, a written report, and it's important that the oral briefing be attended by local health authorities and the stakeholders designated to implement prevention and control measures. This is an opportunity for epidemiologic investigators to describe what has been done, what has been found, and of course, what they theorize should be done. Present the data and epidemiologic findings in a scientifically objective fashion. We look into evidence based recommendations. Part of effective communications is we state our conclusions and recommendations with finality based on technically sound research methodology. But what happened to the Philippines? Never ever interject nonsensical suggestions that are based merely on one's non humorous or even irrational personal opinion or viewpoint, especially during a public health crisis or an epidemic or pandemic. Imagine how silly our government appeared to the international stage or to the international community when the highest governing official suggested that we use gasoline to disinfect people with COVID. And this was not a joke, according to our president back then. This is the importance of effective communication skills. Why would you give nonsensical recommendations when everyone was faced with a dreaded epidemic? And the COVID-19 killed some of our colleagues. The epidemic killed doctors, nurses, physical therapists, nurse aides, even employees, the economic frontliners. And you come up with a joke to control the epidemic. Where is the effective communication there? A written report is a formal scientific document which would include an introduction, background, methodology, results, discussions, and recommendations. This will provide a blueprint for a definitive plan of action. It serves as a record performance, a document for potential legal issues, and a standard reference if the health department encounters a similar situation in the future. This will also contribute to the scientific knowledge base of epidemiology and public health. In recent years, the public has become more aware of and interested in public health. In response, health departments have made great strides in attempting to keep the public informed. Many health departments strive to communicate directly with the public, usually through the media, whether we're talking of newsprint, television, radio, internet, or social media, both during an investigation and when the investigation is concluded. This is perhaps my little contribution to the COVID-19 pandemic. aside from the research that were conducted in terms of controlling symptoms of COVID. So during from 2020 to 2023, we were able to produce at least several real world evidence studies on certain agents that can be given to patients with suspected COVID. And of course, now when you share your level of expertise to a greater number of people, for me, that's my 2 cents. It's my contribution to it's my smallest contribution to how we were able to control the epidemic. Aside from the fact that, of course, I was one of the medical frontliners of the medical city when we were faced with the COVID-19 pandemic. It was such a daunting experience looking at how the pandemic started in 2020 and where we are now, 2025. So, in summary, what have we discussed today? Disease outbreaks or epidemics may occur frequently and are always unexpected events. The most important reason to investigate is to learn enough about the situation to implement appropriate control and prevention measures. Other reasons include taking the opportunity to advance knowledge about the disease, agent, risk factors, interventions, and other scientific issues, responding to public, political, or legal concerns, evaluating health programs' effectiveness and weaknesses, and to provide training. Disease outbreaks and epidemics are the subject of media attention and public concern. So investigators feel pressured to work quickly to find answers. When multiple agencies, stakeholders, and sectors are involved, coordination and communication become even more essential, but are more complicated than usual. Ergo, it is essential to have a systematic plan for conducting this epidemiologic investigation of a disease outbreak. These are some of the references that I used uh, for this particular lecture, and thank you for your kind attention.